The phone rang at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, right in the middle of me fixing a scheduling conflict for Dr. Morrison's surgery team. I grabbed it without checking the caller ID, expecting it to be radiology again, but it was Marcus, my husband. His voice sounded different. Formal, like he was reading from a script. He said he had news, big news, and I could tell from his tone that something was wrong. Uncle Raymond had passed away 3 weeks ago, and the will had finally cleared probate. I started to say I was sorry, started to ask if he was okay, but he cut me off. He said Uncle Raymond had left him everything, the entire estate, $800 million. I remember my hand going numb around the phone. I said something stupid like, "Oh my God, Marcus," because what else do you say when your husband just told you he inherited more money than you can even picture? But he didn't wait for me to process it. He just kept talking in that same flat, businesslike tone. He said I needed to pack my things and leave our apartment immediately. He said this was his fresh start. I thought I'd misheard him. I said, "What?" And my voice came out strangled and confused, because surely he meant something else. But he repeated it, slower this time, like I was dense. "Pack your things. Leave the apartment. This is my fresh start. Not ours. His." My coworker Jenny must have seen my face change because she was suddenly standing next to my desk with her hand on my shoulder. I couldn't feel it. I couldn't feel anything except this cold spreading through my chest like someone had cracked me open and poured ice water directly onto my lungs. I tried to ask him what he meant, tried to say his name again, but he just talked over me. He said he'd already spoken to an attorney and filed separation papers. He said I had until 6 o'clock to collect my personal items, and after that, the locks would be changed. Then he hung up. Jenny asked if I was okay. I told her I had to go. I don't remember the elevator ride down or walking to my car in the parking garage. I just remember sitting in the driver's seat staring at the dashboard clock that said 2:17 and thinking this had to be some kind of sick joke. Marcus didn't make jokes like this. Marcus didn't make any jokes. But this couldn't be real. The drive home took 23 minutes. I hit every red light. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel with both palms just to keep the car steady. I kept replaying his voice in my head, that cold, detached tone, like he was canceling a subscription service instead of ending a 12-year marriage. When I got to our building, I knew it wasn't a joke. There was a moving truck parked in the loading zone out front. I took the stairs because I couldn't stand still long enough to wait for the elevator. By the time I reached our floor, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like they might give out. The apartment door had a new deadbolt, shiny brass, still smelling like metal and oil. I stood there staring at it for a long moment before I knocked. Marcus opened the door, but he didn't look at me. He looked past me, over my shoulder, like I was a stranger delivering a package. Behind him, I could see 2 men in gray uniforms carrying boxes out of the bedroom. There was another man in a suit sitting at the kitchen table with a leather briefcase open in front of him. Marcus stepped aside to let me in, but he still wouldn't meet my eyes. The man in the suit stood up and introduced himself as Richard Calloway, Marcus's attorney. He said, "Mrs. Chen," in this polite, careful way, like my name might shatter if he said it too loud. He told me Marcus had filed separation papers that morning and that I should retain my own counsel. Then he slid a manila folder across the table toward me. I didn't touch it. I looked at Marcus instead. I said his name. I asked him what he was doing, why he was doing this now, and my voice cracked on the last word. He finally looked at me then, but his face was blank. Empty. Like I was a problem he'd already solved. He said he didn't want to do this the hard way. He said the apartment was in his name and the inheritance was his alone, and I needed to accept that and move on. He said it like he was being reasonable, like I was the one being difficult. The lawyer cleared his throat and said something about how I had 2 hours to gather my belongings and that anything left behind would be considered abandoned property. I heard myself laugh, this short, bitter sound that didn't feel like it came from me. I asked Marcus if he was really doing this, if he was really throwing me out of our home the same day he told me about the money. He didn't answer. He just looked at his watch. It was a Rolex, gold and silver, with a blue face. Uncle Raymond had given it to him for our wedding. Marcus wore it every single day for 12 years. I grabbed the folder off the table and walked out. I didn't take anything else. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly to pack, and my vision was blurry, and I knew if I stayed one more second, I'd fall apart in front of him. I ended up at my friend Rachel's place that night. She made up the couch for me and didn't ask too many questions, just handed me a glass of wine and sat next to me while I stared at the separation papers on my phone screen. The document was 16 pages long. It was full of legal language I couldn't parse, but one phrase kept jumping out at me. Distribution per estate plan. Section 7. I didn't know what Section 7 was. I didn't know what any of it meant, but I kept reading that line over and over. I thought about Uncle Raymond. I hadn't seen him in almost 3 years, not since he'd gotten sick and stopped traveling. But I remembered our wedding day. I remembered him pulling me aside during the reception, squeezing my hand in both of his. He'd looked at me with these serious, kind eyes and said, "You're family now, sweetheart, and don't you forget that." I'd thought it was just something old people said at weddings, something nice and forgettable. But sitting on Rachel's couch at midnight, I wondered if he'd meant something more. I called 3 different attorneys the next morning. The first one said he didn't handle high-asset divorces. The second one said his calendar was full for the next 6 months. The third one listened to me explain the situation for about 90 seconds before he said this sounded complicated and he'd have to call me back. Rachel sat across from me at her kitchen table while I scrolled through more law firm websites on my phone. She asked if I'd eaten anything, and I told her I couldn't. My stomach felt like it was full of rocks. She made toast anyway and put it in front of me with strawberry jam. The fourth attorney I called was named Linda Okoye. Her voicemail said she specialized in complex divorce litigation, and when she called me back 2 hours later, her voice was direct and no nonsense. She asked how much the estate was worth. I told her $800 million. There was a pause on the line, and then she said she was listening. I told her everything. The phone call at work, the eviction, the separation papers, the 2-hour deadline. I told her about the new locks and Marcus's blank face, and the lawyer sitting at our kitchen table like this was all perfectly normal. Linda asked if we had a prenuptial agreement. I said no. She asked how long we'd been married. I said 12 years. She asked if the inheritance happened during the marriage. I said yes, 3 weeks ago. Then she said something that made my hands stop shaking for the first time in 24 hours. She said this was marital property. She said it didn't matter what Marcus thought or what his attorney told him. In our state, assets acquired during a marriage are subject to equitable distribution, and inheritance is no exception if it's commingled or if there's no prenup protecting it. I asked her if she was sure, and she said she'd been doing this for 19 years, and she was very sure. Then she asked if I could come to her office that afternoon. I said yes before she even finished the question. Rachel drove me because I still didn't trust myself behind the wheel. Linda's office was in a building downtown with her name on a brass plaque next to the elevator. Her desk had framed law degrees on the wall behind it and a pair of boxing gloves hanging on a hook by the window. She shook my hand and told me to sit down, and then she pulled out a yellow legal pad. She asked me to walk her through the timeline again, slower this time, and she took notes in tight, precise handwriting. She asked about Uncle Raymond. I told her he was Marcus's uncle, not mine, but that he'd always been kind to me. He'd come to our wedding and told me I was family. Linda looked up from her notes and asked if I had any communication from the estate executor. I pulled up the email on my phone, the one Marcus had forwarded me by accident 2 days before Raymond died. It was about updating beneficiary information and reviewing the estate plan. She read it twice, then asked me to forward it to her. She said she needed to see the full will, all 43 pages of it, not just the summary Marcus's attorney had probably given him. I asked how we'd get that. She said the will was filed with the probate court and it was public record. That night, I stayed on Rachel's couch again and tried not to look at my phone, but at 9:30 it buzzed with an Instagram notification. Someone had tagged me in a story. I opened it before I could stop myself. It was Marcus. He was standing on a balcony I didn't recognize, city lights behind him. The girl next to him was young, maybe 24, with long dark hair and a smile that looked performative. Her arm was around his waist. The caption said, "New chapter, new energy," with a sparkle emoji. I clicked on her profile. Her name was Sienna. She had 400,000 followers. Rachel heard me make a sound, something between a gasp and a laugh, and she came over to look at the screen. She said, "Oh my God," and then she said a lot of other things I barely heard because my vision was tunneling and my chest was getting tight again. 3 days. It had been 3 days since he threw me out. My phone started buzzing with texts. Friends asking if I was okay, if I'd seen it, if I knew who she was. One of them forwarded me a screenshot from a group chat I wasn't in. Marcus had written that I was threatening him, that I was being a gold digger, that he had to protect himself. I showed Linda the messages the next morning. She sat back in her chair and looked at the screenshots for a long time without saying anything. Then she told me to document everything. Every post, every message, every communication. She said we'd need it later, and the way she said later made it sound like a promise. She asked if Marcus had hired a lawyer yet. I showed her Richard Calloway's business card. Linda pulled it up on her computer and her mouth tightened. She said he was a real estate attorney who mostly did residential closings. She said he had no business handling a case like this. I asked what that meant. She said it meant Marcus had probably hired someone cheap, someone who didn't know what they were doing, someone who thought this would be simple. She said that was good for us. Arrogant people make mistakes, she told me, and we're going to let him make a lot of them. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. She asked if I could get her the full will, the complete document from the probate court. I told her I didn't know if I could. She said it was public record and we had a legal right to it, but it would be faster if I could access it through the estate executor. I didn't know who the executor was. Linda said we'd find out. She made a call right there from her desk, spoke to someone at the courthouse in a calm, measured voice, and 20 minutes later she had a name. William Graves, Raymond's longtime financial advisor. She told me to go home and rest, and that she'd reach out to Graves in the morning. I asked what I should do in the meantime. She looked at me across the desk, her expression serious but not unkind, and she said, "Survive. Just survive. That's all you need to do right now." Linda called me 4 days later at 11:30 at night. I was half asleep on Rachel's couch when my phone lit up with her name. She didn't apologize for the hour. She just said, "Sit down," and I told her I already was. Then she said, "Your uncle-in-law was a very smart man." She'd gotten the full will from William Graves that afternoon, all 43 pages of it. She said she'd been reading it for the past 6 hours, and she needed me to understand something important. I asked what. She told me to just listen. She started reading from page 18. Her voice was steady and clear, like she was presenting evidence in court. She said, "The will stated that should the primary beneficiary be married at the time of my death, 50% of all liquid assets shall be designated as protected marital property, immune from any prenuptial waiver or separate property claim." I didn't understand at first. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant Raymond had built protection for me directly into the will. He'd made sure that if Marcus inherited while married, half of it automatically became marital property that couldn't be claimed as separate. I told her we didn't have a prenup. Linda said, "Exactly. That's the point. Marcus can't claim the inheritance as separate property because Raymond explicitly prevented that in the estate plan. He knew Marcus would try this. He saw it coming, and he stopped it before it could happen." My hands were shaking again, but this time it felt different. Not like fear, like something breaking open inside my chest. I asked Linda if she was sure if this would actually hold up, and she said she'd stake her career on it. She said this clause was ironclad. Then she told me something else. She said Marcus's attorney had clearly never read past page 5 of the will. The summary version, the one that just listed Marcus as primary beneficiary, was on page 3. Tyler Calloway had stopped there and assumed that was the whole story. Linda said it was malpractice-level incompetence. She said any halfway decent attorney would have read the entire document before filing separation papers. But Tyler hadn't. He'd skimmed the summary, congratulated Marcus on his windfall, and told him to get rid of me as fast as possible. I asked what we should do now. Linda said nothing. Not yet. She said we were going to let Marcus think he won, let him get comfortable, let him make more mistakes. She said arrogant people always do. They can't help themselves. She told me about the handwritten note she'd found in the margin of page 18. Raymond's handwriting, shaky but clear. It said, "Protect her." Just those 2 words. Linda said there was another note further down that said, "Marcus needs someone steady." I started crying, and I couldn't stop. Rachel heard me from the bedroom and came out to check on me, but I waved her away because I needed to hear the rest. Linda waited until I got control of my breathing, and then she said we were going to build this case slowly. She said Marcus would refuse to settle. She said he'd dig in, hide assets, make threats. She said he'd do exactly what guilty people always do when they think they have all the power, and every single thing he did would make the eventual judgment worse for him. I asked how much worse. Linda said she couldn't promise anything, but based on the will clause and Marcus's behavior so far, we were looking at a 50-50 split of liquid assets at minimum. That was $400 million. Maybe more if he kept being stupid. I felt dizzy. I told Linda I didn't want his money. I just wanted him to stop erasing me like I'd never mattered. She said that's what this was about, making sure he couldn't pretend the last 12 years didn't happen, making sure there was proof that I'd been his partner, his family. She asked if I was ready for this to get ugly. She said Marcus would fight, his attorney would threaten, and people who didn't know the full story would probably take his side. She said I needed to be prepared for that. I told her I was already prepared. He'd made sure of that. Linda told me she'd draft a formal response to the separation filing and request full financial discovery. She said she'd make it clear that we knew about the inheritance and that we were claiming marital interest in it. She said Marcus would lose his mind when he saw it. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Don't mistake his cruelty for strength. Cruel people are just scared people with power, and we're about to take the power away." I asked her when. She said soon, just not yet. I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. Rachel had gone back to bed. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street below. I pulled up the photo from our wedding on my phone. Uncle Raymond was in the background of one shot, standing near the dessert table with a champagne flute in his hand. He was watching Marcus and me cut the cake. His expression was thoughtful, not quite smiling, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. I zoomed in on his face and wondered how long he'd known, how long he'd been planning this. If he'd written, "That will clause the day of our wedding," or years later when Marcus started changing, when the promotions came and the money got better and Marcus started talking about people like they were investments. I thought about the last time I'd seen Raymond. It was at a hospital in Boston 3 years ago. He'd just finished another round of chemo and he looked so small in that bed, but when I walked in, he'd smiled and said, "There's my favorite niece." I'd told him I wasn't technically his niece. He'd squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left and said, "You are to me." He asked how Marcus was treating me. I'd lied and said everything was fine. He'd looked at me for a long moment, and I'd wondered if he knew, if he could see through me the same way he seemed to see through everyone. Now I knew he had. He'd seen exactly who Marcus was and exactly who I was, and he'd made sure I wouldn't be thrown away the second I wasn't useful anymore. He'd protected me when I didn't even know I needed protecting. Linda had told me not to contact Marcus, not to respond to any messages, not to engage with the Instagram posts, not to give him anything he could use against me later. She said we were playing a long game now and patience was the only weapon that mattered. So I deleted Instagram off my phone. I turned off notifications for everything except calls from Linda. And I waited. Because for the first time since that phone call at work, I had something Marcus didn't. I had leverage. And he had no idea it was coming. Linda sent Marcus's attorney a formal response 2 weeks later. She didn't tell me what was in it. She just said Tyler would call within 24 hours. And she was right. He called in 18. She put him on speakerphone so I could hear. Tyler's voice was tight and defensive. He said his client had made a generous settlement offer of $50 million and expected it to be accepted within 7 business days. Linda asked what made it generous. Tyler said Marcus was being more than fair considering the inheritance was separate property. Linda let the silence stretch out for a few seconds. Then she asked Tyler if he'd read the full will. He said of course he had. She asked him what page. Section 7 was on. He didn't answer right away. She said, "It's page 18, Tyler, and you should probably read it before you call me again." She hung up. I asked what would happen now. Linda said Tyler would read the clause, panic, call Marcus, and then Marcus would refuse to believe it mattered. She said men like Marcus always think they can lawyer their way out of consequences. She was right about that, too. 3 days later, Linda got an email from Tyler. The subject line said, "Settlement rejection." Linda read it out loud to me in her office. Tyler had written that his client believed the inheritance was separate property acquired through family lineage and that we would see them in court. Linda leaned back in her chair and smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. She said, "Marcus just made this so much worse for himself." I asked how much worse. She said we were about to find out. Then she filed a motion for full financial discovery and requested access to all of Marcus's bank accounts and asset transfers. The hearing for discovery was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Linda hired a forensic accountant named David Chen. "No relation to Marcus," she'd said, "but wouldn't that be funny?" David was quiet and methodical, the kind of person who looked like he enjoyed spreadsheets. He started pulling Marcus's financial records through the discovery process. Bank statements, investment accounts, credit card transactions. Linda said it was routine for high-asset divorces. She said we were just making sure everything was accounted for, but her tone suggested she was looking for something specific. 2 weeks into the discovery process, David called Linda's office and asked us both to come in. He had his laptop open on the conference table with about 15 different windows pulled up. He looked excited in a way that accountants probably weren't supposed to look excited. He told us Marcus had opened a new bank account in the Cayman Islands exactly 2 weeks after the inheritance cleared probate. The initial deposit was $120 million. There were 3 subsequent transfers totaling another $95 million over the next month. Linda asked if Marcus had disclosed this account in his financial affidavit. David said no. He'd listed his domestic accounts and his investment portfolio, but there was no mention of any offshore holdings. Linda said, "That's asset concealment, and it's a federal issue now." I felt cold all over. I asked what that meant. Linda said it meant Marcus wasn't just trying to keep the inheritance, he was actively hiding money to make sure I got as little as possible. She said judges didn't like that. She said judges really didn't like that. David kept clicking to screens. He said there were more accounts. He'd found 2 in Singapore and 1 in Switzerland. All opened within 6 weeks of the inheritance. The total amount hidden was around $215 million, more than a quarter of the estate. Linda asked if he could prove Marcus controlled these accounts. David said absolutely. The wire transfers all originated from Marcus's primary checking account, and the signature cards for the offshore accounts had been notarized at a UBS branch in Manhattan. Marcus had signed them himself. I sat there staring at the spreadsheet on David's screen, all those numbers in neat little rows, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than that. Marcus hadn't just thrown me out. He'd planned this. He'd spent weeks moving money around to make sure I'd walk away with nothing. Linda told David to document everything and prepare a full report for the court. She said we'd be filing an emergency motion to freeze all of Marcus's assets, domestic and foreign, pending the outcome of the divorce. She said this kind of concealment usually triggered sanctions. I asked what kind of sanctions. Linda said financial penalties, sometimes significant ones. She said the court could award me a larger share of the marital estate as punishment for Marcus's behavior. She said it depended on the judge, but this was bad enough that sanctions were almost guaranteed. That night, I made the mistake of looking at my old Instagram account on Rachel's laptop. I deleted the app from my phone, but I still remembered my password. Sienna had posted a new video. It was a TikTok that had been cross-posted. She was in a penthouse somewhere, designer shopping bags visible on the counter behind her. The caption said, "My boyfriend's ex is so bitter, lol." The comments were a mix of people defending her and people calling her out. Someone had written, "Imagine being a homewrecker and bragging about it." Someone else had written, "She's not a homewrecker, she's an upgrade." I closed the laptop. Rachel asked if I was okay. I told her I didn't know. She said Sienna was just a kid who didn't understand what she'd walked into. I said Sienna was 24 years old and had 400,000 followers. She understood exactly what she was doing. But I also understood something else. Sienna wasn't the problem. Marcus was. Sienna was just the shiny new thing that made him feel young and important. She was proof that he could afford better now. That's how he'd think of it. Like I was an old car he'd traded in for a newer model. I thought about the 12 years I'd spent building a life with him. The dinners I'd cooked, the late nights I'd stayed up when he was stressed about work, the way I'd supported him through his father's death and his career changes, and every single disappointment. I thought about how easily he'd erased all of it. Linda had said something during our last meeting. She'd said I wasn't fighting to get Marcus back. She said I was fighting to make sure he couldn't pretend I'd never existed. To make sure there was a legal record that said I mattered. That our marriage mattered. She was right. I didn't want him back. I didn't even want the money, not really. I just wanted him to be held accountable. I wanted him to face consequences for once in his life, instead of skating by on charm and money and other people's kindness. 2 days later, David called again. Linda put him on speaker. He said he'd found 3 additional accounts. 2 more in the Cayman Islands and 1 in Luxembourg. He said Marcus had been busy. He said the total concealed assets now stood at just over $250 million. Linda asked how he'd found them. David said Marcus had been sloppy. The wire transfers left a clear trail, and some of the accounts were still linked to his domestic email address. He said it was almost like Marcus didn't think anyone would look, or didn't think it mattered if they did. I asked Linda what happened now. She said we took everything David found, and we buried Marcus with it in court. She said the trial date was set for 8 weeks out, and we had more than enough to prove willful asset dissipation. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. She told me to prepare myself. She said trial would be ugly. Marcus would be there with his attorney and probably Sienna, and I'd have to sit in that courtroom and listen to them try to explain why hiding $250 million was somehow reasonable. She asked if I could handle that. I told her yes. Because at this point, I didn't have a choice, and because somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear Uncle Raymond's voice from that hospital room 3 years ago. I could still feel his hand squeezing mine. I could still see that knowing look in his eyes. He'd protected me because he knew this was coming, and I wasn't going to let that protection go to waste. The courthouse was older than I expected. Gray stone, high ceilings, the kind of building that made every sound echo. Linda met me outside at 8:30 in the morning. She was wearing a navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 100 trials before this one. She asked if I was ready. I told her I'd never be ready, but I was here anyway. She squeezed my shoulder and said that was good enough. Then we walked through the metal detectors and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The courtroom was at the end of a long hallway. Marcus was already there when we walked in. He was sitting at the defendant's table with Tyler, wearing a suit that probably cost $8,000. Charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, with a burgundy tie. He looked like someone important, someone who belonged in a room like this. Sienna was in the gallery behind him. She was wearing sunglasses, even though we were indoors, and she had her phone in her lap. Marcus turned when he heard the door open. Our eyes met for half a second before he looked away. His jaw was tight. The bailiff called us to order, and the judge walked in. Her name was Judge Patricia Hernandez. She was maybe 60, with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She sat down, looked at both tables, and told us to begin. Linda stood up and laid out our case in 20 minutes. She explained the will clause on page 18. She explained how Raymond had explicitly designated 50% of liquid assets as protected marital property. She explained that Marcus had concealed over $250 million in offshore accounts. Tyler objected twice. Judge Hernandez overruled him both times. Linda pulled up bank records on the screen at the front of the courtroom. Wire transfer dates, account numbers, notarized signature cards, everything David had found. It was damning, and we all knew it. Then it was Tyler's turn. He stood up and tried to argue that the inheritance was separate property under family lineage laws. Judge Hernandez stopped him. She asked if he'd read Section 7 of the will. Tyler said he had. She asked him to explain it. Tyler stammered. He said something about how the clause was ambiguous and could be interpreted multiple ways. Judge Hernandez asked which part of 50% of liquid assets shall be protected. Marital property was ambiguous. Tyler didn't have an answer. He said he'd need to review the language again. Judge Hernandez took off her glasses. She asked Tyler how long he'd been practicing law. He said 12 years. She asked how many high-asset divorces he'd handled. He said this was his first. She asked if he'd consulted with anyone experienced in estate law before filing separation papers. He said no. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers on the keys. Judge Hernandez told Tyler to sit down. Then she asked the bailiff to bring up the will documents. She read Section 7 out loud herself. Her voice was clear and measured and filled the entire room. When she got to the part about protected marital property, she paused. Then she kept reading. There was a handwritten note in the margin. She read that too. It said, "Protect her. Marcus needs someone steady." Judge Hernandez looked at Marcus. She asked if that was his uncle's handwriting. Marcus said yes, but his voice was barely audible. Judge Hernandez asked him to speak up. He said yes, Your Honor, and this time everyone could hear him. She asked if he'd read this notation before filing for separation. Marcus glanced at Tyler. He said he'd been told it wasn't legally binding. Judge Hernandez said a testator's intent is always legally relevant, especially when it's written directly into the governing document. She said it was clear that Raymond had anticipated exactly this scenario and had taken steps to prevent it. She said ignoring that intent was not only legally untenable but morally questionable. I watched Marcus's face change. The confidence drained out of it. His shoulders went tight and his hands pressed flat against the table in front of him. Sienna was scrolling on her phone in the gallery. She wasn't even listening. Then Linda called David Chen to the stand. David walked up with a folder full of documents and raised his right hand for the oath. Linda asked him to explain what he'd found during the discovery process. David laid it out piece by piece. The Cayman accounts, the Singapore accounts, the Luxembourg account. He explained how Marcus had transferred $215 million across multiple offshore jurisdictions within 6 weeks of receiving the inheritance. He explained how none of these accounts had been disclosed in Marcus's initial financial affidavit. He said the concealment appeared intentional and systematic. Tyler tried to object. He said the offshore accounts were for tax planning purposes. Judge Hernandez asked if Marcus had disclosed them to the IRS. Tyler said he'd have to check. Judge Hernandez said she'd give him 5 seconds. Tyler said he didn't know. She said that's what she thought. Linda asked David if this kind of asset movement was normal. David said absolutely not. He said most people consolidate assets after an inheritance. They don't scatter them across foreign jurisdictions. He said the only reason to do this was to hide the money from someone. In this case, from me. Judge Hernandez asked to see the wire transfer records. David handed them to the bailiff, who brought them up to the bench. The judge spent several minutes reading through them. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Finally, she looked up. She said this was willful asset dissipation. She said Marcus had clearly attempted to conceal a substantial portion of the marital estate in order to avoid equitable distribution. She said this behavior warranted sanctions. Tyler started to stand up, but Judge Hernandez held up one hand and he sat back down. She ruled that the inheritance was marital property subject to 50-50 split per Raymond's explicit instructions in the will. That meant $400 million to me, $400 million to Marcus. But she wasn't finished. She said Marcus's concealment of assets constituted bad faith conduct. She imposed sanctions of $75 million to be paid for Marcus's share of the estate. She said the money would go directly to me as compensation for the time, expense, and emotional harm caused by his deliberate misconduct. She said she was also awarding attorney's fees. I heard someone gasp behind me. It might have been Sienna. Linda's hand found mine under the table and squeezed. Judge Hernandez asked if Marcus understood the ruling. He said yes, in a voice that sounded hollow. She asked if he had anything to say. He shook his head. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Mr. Chen, your uncle tried to protect your wife from exactly this kind of cruelty. He saw something in you that made him worry. And everything you've done in this courtroom today has proven he was right to worry." Marcus's face went pale. He looked like he might be sick. Tyler was frantically taking notes, probably already thinking about the appeal he'd have to file. Judge Hernandez signed the order and handed it to the bailiff. She said the ruling was effective immediately and that all offshore accounts were to be frozen pending transfer. The hearing was over. People started gathering their things. Sienna stood up and walked toward the door without looking back. Marcus called her name, but she didn't stop. He tried to follow her, but the bailiff stepped in front of him and said he needed to stay until the paperwork was processed. Linda and I walked out into the hallway. My legs felt shaky and strange, like I'd been sitting still for days instead of 2 hours. Linda asked how I was doing. I told her I didn't know. She said that was fair. She said I'd probably need a few days to process what just happened. I asked her what happened to Marcus now. She said he'd pay the judgment, probably from the liquid assets that hadn't been hidden. She said he'd still be wealthy, just not as wealthy as he thought he'd be. She said his reputation in business circles would take a hit after this. We took the elevator down to the lobby. The morning had turned into afternoon. Sunlight was coming through the tall windows, making bright squares on the marble floor. Linda walked me outside and told me she'd send the final paperwork within a week. She said congratulations, but she said it gently. I stood on the courthouse steps for a long time after she left. I thought about Marcus sitting in that courtroom, his face pale and shocked, finally understanding that actions have consequences. I thought about Uncle Raymond writing those words in the margin of his will. Protect her. He'd known. Somehow he'd known this would happen, and he'd made sure I wouldn't be thrown away like I was nothing. 6 months after the trial, I stood in front of a room full of women I'd never met before. The space was in a community center in Brooklyn, the kind with fluorescent lights and folding chairs and a coffee station in the corner. There were 212 women there. I'd counted. I told them my story. Not all of it, just the parts that mattered, the phone call at work, the eviction, the inheritance I didn't know was protected, the offshore accounts, the courtroom. I told them how Uncle Raymond had seen something coming that I couldn't see myself. When I finished, a woman in the third row raised her hand. She asked how I'd known to hire a good attorney. I told her the truth. I'd gotten lucky. I'd called 4 lawyers, and 3 of them turned me down. If Linda hadn't answered that 4th call, I might have given up. That's when I realized what I needed to do with the money. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough to make sure other women didn't have to get lucky, enough to make sure they had resources and information and someone in their corner when everything fell apart. I used $50 million from the settlement to start the Raymond's Legacy Fund. It was a nonprofit focused on financial literacy and legal support for women going through sudden divorces, especially women who didn't know their rights or couldn't afford good representation. The first office was small, just 3 rooms in a building in Midtown. I hired 2 attorneys, a financial counselor, and an administrative coordinator. We started with free consultations and workshops. The demand was overwhelming. Within 2 months, we had a waiting list. I put Raymond's photo on the wall behind my desk. It was from my wedding day. He was standing near the dessert table with that thoughtful expression I remembered, looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. Every morning when I came in, I'd look at that photo and think about what he'd done for me. He'd barely known me. We'd spent maybe 20 hours together total over the course of 12 years. But he'd seen me clearly enough to know I'd need protection. He'd cared enough to build that protection into his will, even though it cost him nothing to just let Marcus have everything. Marcus sent 2 emails in those 6 months. I deleted both without reading them. My therapist said I didn't owe him closure. She said closure was something I had to find for myself, not something he could give me. I was working on that. A mutual friend forwarded me an article from a business magazine about 3 months after the trial. The headline was something about wealth management and cautionary tales. Marcus's name was in the 3rd paragraph. The article said investors were avoiding him after the asset concealment scandal. It said his credibility had taken a significant hit and several partnerships had fallen through. It said he was still wealthy, still living well, but the doors that used to open for him weren't opening anymore. I read it once and then closed the browser. I didn't need to know more than that. He'd wanted a fresh start. He'd gotten one, just not the kind he'd imagined. He still had money, more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. But he'd lost the thing he'd actually wanted, which was the freedom to do whatever he wanted without consequences. I thought about Sienna sometimes. I wondered if she'd stayed or if she'd left when the money got cut in half. I wondered if Marcus told her the truth about what happened, or if he'd found a way to make himself the victim. I'd never know, and it didn't really matter. The workshops kept growing. We added evening sessions for women who worked during the day. We started a mentorship program pairing newly divorced women with others who'd been through it. We created a database of vetted attorneys in 12 states who'd work on sliding scale fees. One afternoon, I was meeting with a woman named Jennifer who'd been married for 18 years. Her husband had inherited a business from his father and immediately filed for divorce. She'd brought separation papers that looked almost identical to the ones Marcus had given me. I walked her through everything. The timeline, the questions to ask, the documents to request. I told her about marital property laws and discovery processes and what to look for in an attorney. When we finished, she started crying. She said she'd thought she was alone. I told her she wasn't. I told her none of us were. That was the whole point of this place, to make sure women knew their worth wasn't determined by whether someone decided to throw them away, to make sure they had the tools to fight back when someone tried. That night, I drove out to the cemetery where Raymond was buried. I hadn't been there since the funeral 3 years ago. His headstone was simple, just his name and dates and a line that said, "Beloved uncle and friend." Someone had left flowers recently. Maybe Marcus. Maybe someone else. I put my own flowers down. White roses. I didn't say anything out loud because that felt performative, but I thought about what I wanted to tell him. Thank you felt too small. You saved me felt too dramatic. You saw me when no one else did felt closer to the truth. He protected someone he barely knew because it was the right thing to do. because he'd seen his nephew clearly enough to know what Marcus was capable of, because he'd believed I deserved better than being erased the moment I stopped being convenient. I thought about the 12 years I'd spent with Marcus, the good parts and the bad parts and all the mundane parts in between. I thought about how I believed we were building something together and how easily he'd decided to demolish it all the second he got the chance. But I also thought about the 212 women in that community center, the workshops filling up, the database growing, the phone calls from women who said they'd found us online and didn't know where else to turn, the attorneys reaching out to volunteer their time. Marcus had thought money would erase me. He'd thought wealth was the same thing as power, and that power meant he could do whatever he wanted without facing consequences. He'd been wrong about all of it. The money hadn't erased me. It had revealed exactly who he always was. And in revealing that, it had also revealed who I needed to become. Not bitter, not broken, just someone who understood that cruelty had consequences and that protection was something you could build for other people even after you were gone. I stood at Raymond's grave until the sun started to set. The cemetery was quiet except for birds and the distant sound of traffic. I thought about him writing those words in the margin of his will. Protect her. 2 words that changed everything. Before I left, I said one thing out loud. I said, I'm protecting them now. I don't know if he would have heard me. I don't know if it even mattered. But it felt important to say it anyway. To close the circle he'd started. The drive back to the city took 40 minutes. Rush hour traffic, brake lights stretching for miles. I didn't mind. I turned on the radio and let my mind go quiet. When I got home to my apartment, the simple one with books everywhere and Raymond's photo on the shelf, I made dinner and sat by the window. My phone buzzed with an email. Another workshop registration. A woman named Sarah from New Jersey. Her husband had just inherited his family's real estate portfolio. She'd been married 16 years. The email said, "Please help. I don't know what to do." I wrote back and scheduled her for next Tuesday. Then I added her name to the spreadsheet. She'd be number 471. 471 women in 6 months. The number still shocked me sometimes. How many of us there were. How common this kind of betrayal was. But it also reminded me that Raymond's gift hadn't just been the money. It had been the knowledge that someone could see you clearly and choose to protect you anyway. That someone could look at a situation and decide that doing the right thing mattered more than staying silent. That's what I wanted to build. Not just a nonprofit, not just a fund, a legacy that said you matter, even when someone's trying to tell you that you don't. That said consequences are real, and protection is possible, and sometimes the people who save you are the ones you least expect. Thank you for listening to this story. If you or someone you know has experienced something similar, I hope you'll remember that you're not alone, and that there are people and resources designed to help you through it. If you enjoyed this story, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. We upload new stories every day, real betrayals, real consequences, real karma, the kind that makes sense in the real world. Until next time, take care of yourself.